Have you ever been cast aside, not for what you did, but simply for what you couldn't give? In a small Oregon town in 1963, Clara Whitmore was sold by her own father, not for money alone, but to escape the shame of a daughter who couldn't bear children. She was traded like a burden and handed off to a quiet widower with 3 kids and no time for questions. What happens to a woman when everything that once defined her wife, daughter, woman is stripped away? What do you hold on to when even your name feels borrowed? Now imagine this. You've been discarded, humiliated in front of your neighbors, and then a man offers no words, only kindness. Would you follow him into the unknown? Clara did, and what unfolded wasn't a romance, it was something deeper. A story about healing, not with grand gestures, but with small hands reaching for yours in the dark. About finding home, not in blood, but in belonging. Stay with us and step into the quiet miracle of Clara's second chance. Because sometimes the most powerful roots grow in the coldest soil. They didn't whisper about her in secret anymore. They whispered right to her face. The town square of Copper Hollow hadn't changed in years. The same uneven bricks lined the paths. The same bell atop the courthouse tower clanged 3 times as if to mark her shame. Clara stood stiff beside her father near the edge of the general store's porch, the breeze tugging at her hem like a restless child. She didn't look at the flyer nailed to the post. Something about the Thanksgiving harvest social. Warm lettering curling under the wind. The word welcome felt like a cruel joke. Stand up straight, her father growled from the corner of his mouth, tipping his hat back as if this were a business deal. Don't slouch like you're guilty of something. Clara didn't answer. There was no defense that wouldn't be used against her later. Her old cardigan, 2 buttons missing, sleeves stretched thin, offered little warmth against the October chill or the stares from across the street. 2 women outside the diner lowered their cups, just enough to murmur. A man pumping gas nodded once toward her, then turned away. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat and stepped forward, raising his voice like he was at the livestock auction again. Need a reliable hand, he called out. Good with cleaning, sewing, cooking, quiet as a cat, doesn't eat much, bit past her prime, but useful, long as you're not expecting children. A few chuckles rippled from the sidewalk. Someone coughed. The word barren drifted into the air like sawdust. Clara looked down at her shoes' cracked leather, laces mismatched. She focused on breathing slow and even, the way her mother used to teach her during storms. But the storm was made of people. A child peeked out from behind her mother's coat. A teenager laughed behind his palm. Across the square, a man leaned against a post, arms folded, watching. Mr. Whitmore shifted, impatient. She ain't cursed, just unlucky. Price of a decent heifer. Less, even. The breeze caught the hem of Clara's dress again. Still, she stood. Her pride wasn't gone, just buried, like bulbs beneath frost. Then came the sound of boots, heavy, measured, the kind of step that didn't rush, didn't hesitate. The man from across the square approached, broad-shouldered, coat dusted with pine shavings, face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't speak. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded bundle of bills, creased, worn, but real. He handed it to Mr. Whitmore without a word. Her father eyed the money, then the man. No refunds. You take her. She's yours. The man didn't flinch. He looked at Clara. Just looked. Not with pity. Not with desire. Just stillness. You won't be judged anymore, he said. Then he turned, walked back across the street. climbed into a pickup so old the door creaked before it shut. He didn't look back. Mr. Whitmore clapped his hands once. Well, go on. Then. Clara hesitated. The bell tower chimed again. Her feet felt nailed to the brick. But then she stepped forward. The town didn't part for her. No one wished her well. The women sipped their coffee, steam curling into the breeze. A dog barked somewhere near the barber's. The man at the gas pump spit onto the gravel. She climbed into the passenger side of the truck. The seat was cold and cracked, the air inside tinged with oil and cedar. The man, Eli, she'd learn later, didn't say a word. He put the truck into gear. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. As the truck pulled away, Clara looked back at the town for the last time and whispered, "Good riddance," but her fingers tremble. The farther they drove from town, the quieter the world became until the only sound was the ticking of her fear. Clara folded her hands in her lap, knuckles pale, eyes locked on the road that twisted between pines and yellowing ferns. The pickup rattled with every bump, and the trees grew thicker the farther they went, swallowing up any sign of fences or power lines. Her mind drifted, not to escape, but to steady herself. She remembered the small classroom back in Salem, her chalkboard smudged with verbs, the squeak of boots on linoleum, even the days the boys played pranks with crickets in her drawer. None of it had unnerved her like this silence. The truck slowed as they turned onto a narrow gravel lane. A crooked mailbox leaned against a post carved with W ridge. The world narrowed to crunching stones and the steady rhythm of tires spinning dust. Finally, they pulled into a clearing, a one-floor cabin with a slanted tin roof and faded green shutters. Smoke rose, gently, from the chimney. A rusted wagon wheel leaned against the barn. The air smelled of pine, earth, and the faint memory of wood smoke long soaked into walls. Eli cut the engine. He stepped out, opened the tailgate, and pulled down a sack of flour and a bag of apples. Clara hesitated, then opened her door and climbed out, her worn shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. A set of small faces peeked from behind the window curtain. 3 children, not speaking, just watching. Eli didn't wave them out. He just opened the front door and called over his shoulder, "This is Miss Clara. She'll be staying." Inside, the warmth wrapped around her, thick and quiet. The scent of boiled fabric clung to the corners. Along with the dry tang of pine resin and iron pots, a small wood stove crackled low near the center. Eli dropped the groceries onto the kitchen table, nodded once toward the narrow staircase, and said, "Room's up there. Right's warmer." Clara carried her small bag, just a brush, a locket, and 2 books to the second floor. The steps creaked. The room was plain: a narrow bed, a patchwork quilt, a chipped dresser, and a window looking out over the trees. The quilt smelled faintly of lavender and dust. She unpacked nothing. When she came down again, 3 children were gathered near the stove. The boy must have been 10, dark-haired, sharp eyes. He stood slightly in front of the younger 2. The girl, maybe 7, had a quiet face and held the boy's sleeve tightly. The youngest, 4 or so, clutched a wooden spoon like a sword. None of them spoke. Clara offered a small smile. "I'm Clara," she said softly. They didn't answer. Eli, kneeling by the stove, simply said, "Miss Clara," as if correcting her. The meal was already prepared: baked beans, slices of ham from a tin, and canned peaches. The table had 4 chairs, and Eli brought over a wooden stool for Clara. No one passed anything. Everyone just reached and chewed. The only sound came from the small radio near the sink, reporting the weather with crackling static 52 degrees and breezy, frost expected by morning. Clara ate quietly, chewing slower than she needed to. Her eyes flicked from the children's hands to their eyes, searching for a place to rest her presence. When Will spilled beans on the table, no one corrected him. When Sadie dropped her fork, she didn't ask for another. Clara rose, fetched one, and placed it beside the plate without a word. After dinner, Eli stood. I'll bring in wood. Clara reached for the plates. I'll wash. The room paused. Noah, the eldest, didn't sit back down. But he didn't leave either. He stood beside the sink as Clara scrubbed his eyes sharp, unreadable. She dried each plate with care, folding the towel slowly. Noah said nothing. Later, while tidying the counter, she saw the small oven's dial still glowing. She turned it off and peeked inside. The cornbread had burned black crust around the edge. The center cracked dry. She pulled it out with a pot holder just as Eli walked in. Smoke curled toward the ceiling. Clara tensed. He glanced at the pan, then at her. Try less heat next time. No accusation, no sigh, just fact. He grabbed 2 logs from the hearth bin and stepped back out. Clara stood for a moment longer, holding the ruined cornbread, her hand warming through the cloth. Her throat prickled, but she swallowed it down. That night, the children climbed the ladder to the loft they shared. Clara heard soft thumps, a cough, a rustle of blankets. She sat by the cold stove, holding a mug of hot water. Upstairs, 2 small voices murmured through the wood slats. Is she gonna stay? Will asked. Sadie paused. Then I don't know. Clara didn't move, didn't blink. She just listened. In the hush of early morning, Clara found the house easier to love than its people. She moved barefoot across the wooden floor, the boards still cool from the night air. The stove had gone quiet sometime after midnight, but the smell of ash and faint cinnamon still lingered in the corners of the room. A kettle sat on the edge of the stove, warm enough to coax steam, and Clara poured just enough into a chipped mug to warm her hands. Outside, dew clung to the porch rail like glass beads. A single jay called from the pine. Upstairs, the loft remained still. She liked these hours before words were expected. In silence, there was no need to prove herself. The house, in its soft light, welcomed her in small ways, the way her slippers slid across the floor without squeaking, the familiar scrape of the chair at the table, the gentle crack of old wood warming in the sun. By the hallway wall, a piece of paper had curled slightly from behind a nail. She smoothed it back gently, fingers tracing the lines. It was a child's drawing, faded crayon, dull with age. A woman with long hair stood between 3 stick figures, 2 boys, 1 girl. She was smiling. Clara wasn't sure if it was drawn before the loss or after, by memory. She folded the hem of her robe and turned toward the wash basin. Laundry day. It had rained lightly the day before, leaving the linens slightly sour. She carried the basket outside, shook each sheet, and pinned them to the line where pine needles still clung to the cord. Her sleeves dampened quickly, but she didn't mind. Inside, Sadie coughed. It was small at first, just a dry little bark, but when it came again, wet, deeper, Clara set down the clothespin. Upstairs, Sadie sat curled in the corner of the bunk, cheeks flushed, her arms wrapped around a worn rabbit doll. Clara knelt beside her. How long has this been happening? Sadie shrugged. Her lips were pale, but her eyes looked glassy and far away. All right, Clara whispered. We'll take care of it. She wasn't a nurse, but her mother had been. Clara had learned enough from bandaging scrapes and calming colds in a school full of underdressed children with runny noses. She brought down the tin of old remedies she'd unpacked and tucked behind the dry goods mustard powder, flannel strips, a tiny jar of eucalyptus. By late morning, the cough grew deeper. Clara made a mustard poultice, warm and damp, and pressed it gently to Sadie's chest beneath her nightgown. She hummed without thinking, "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine," while placing cool cloths on the girl's forehead. Noah peeked in and stood at the doorframe, his mouth tight. Clara said nothing, but moved slightly so he could see Sadie's face. He didn't step in. Outside, the crunch of boots on gravel signaled Eli's return. He entered with the smell of sawdust and wind on his coat, his brows knit at the sight of Clara kneeling, the towel in her lap. "She's warm," Clara said simply. He knelt beside the bed, unsure. "Should we get the doctor? She's holding steady," Clara said. "We'll watch tonight." Eli looked at Sadie, then at Clara. "You sure?" "No," she admitted, "but I know how to keep her comfortable." He rose and backed out slowly. Clara remained. That night, the house was quiet, but for the crackle of the stove and the girls' uneven breaths. Clara dozed lightly in a chair near the bed, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Every hour, she stirred to feel Sadie's forehead, refresh the cloths, whisper a line of song. At one point, the fever spiked. Sadie whimpered and kicked off the covers. Clara soothed her with a hand on her back, her voice just above a breath. The other night, dear, as I lay sleeping, when dawn crept in through the window, gold and slow, Sadie's eyes fluttered open. She blinked once, then turned her face into Clara's hand. "Mama used to hum like that," she murmured. Clara didn't move. Her chest filled, but she kept her hand steady, her fingers cool against the girl's cheek. Later, after Sadie drifted back to sleep, Clara tucked the quilt gently around her and tiptoed downstairs. The kitchen held the soft hush of early morning, the same as the one she'd begun with, but now it felt different, not warmer, but familiar. She poured water into the basin, wiped her face, and climbed the stairs to her room. She peeled off her robe, slipped into her long johns, and sat at the edge of the bed, with lead in her limbs. Her pillow had shifted. She reached for it and felt something crinkled tucked beneath. Unfolding it slowly, she saw a new drawing. In sharp, dark pencil lines, a tall woman holding the hand of a smaller girl, beneath a crooked pine. They were both smiling. Clara wasn't the one who stared anymore now. She was the one being stared at. Copper Hollow's main street hadn't changed much since the day she'd been humiliated there. The pumpkins on hay bales had returned, arranged just so outside the general store. Cornstalk bundles leaned against lampposts, and garlands of faded leaves fluttered in the cool wind. Saturday mornings brought families in their Sunday best a day early, and Clara, walking beside Eli and holding Sadie's small hand, felt each glance settle on her like a wrinkle in a fresh-pressed dress. Sadie's grip was tight. Her little fingers wrapped around Clara's with quiet insistence. The girl's cheeks were flushed, not from fever this time, but from anticipation. This was their first time going into town together since Clara had arrived. Eli walked a few steps behind, hands in his coat pockets, boots soft against the gravel. The bell above the general store door jingled as they entered. The scent of sawdust and cinnamon hung in the air. Glass jars of peppermints lined the counter, and a chalkboard listed prices for flour, salt, and candles. A tip jar rested beside the register, half full with quarters and the occasional folded dollar. Tommy Ridge stood behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. He nodded toward Eli, then his eyes flicked to Clara. His smile was thin and short-lived. "Didn't expect to see you in here again." Clara offered a polite nod, her voice steady. "We're just picking up cider and nails." Tommy handed over the cider jug, cold and sticky to the touch. "Heard you're helping out up at Willow Ridge," he said, not looking at her directly. "Thought you'd be somewhere more permanent." Clara said nothing. Sadie stepped a little closer. A woman near the shelf of preserves turned sharply. "Is that her?" she whispered to her friend, not quite quietly. "The one who couldn't keep a husband." The voice froze Clara in place. Not the tone, but the familiarity. Her eyes shifted and landed on a pair of white gloves wrapped around a too small purse. Clara's ex-sister-in-law stood framed in the window light, hair pinned up in perfect swirls. Beside her, another woman snickered into her palm. "Can't believe she came back," the sister-in-law said, louder this time, wearing that same cardigan like it still fits. Clara's breath stayed shallow, her spine stiff. Her old life, the one she'd left behind like spoiled food, had crept back into the room on pointed heels. "She doesn't look cursed," the other woman said mockingly, "just worn thin." Behind her, Eli stepped forward. Just a small shift, a half step closer, but Clara felt it. His presence settled beside her like a fence against the wind. "She's the only reason my kids still laugh," he said, voice low and even. "The only one who remembers how Sadie likes her apples sliced, and who can get Will to sleep without crying." The room stilled. Clara's ex-in-law opened her mouth, then shut it. Even Tommy Ridge had gone still behind the counter. His hand paused mid-motion over the tip jar. The silence left just enough space for Clara's voice. "Better barren than bitter," she said. Then she turned. Her hands didn't shake. Her cheeks didn't burn. She took the cider in one arm, held Sadie's hand with the other, and walked out. Eli followed, saying nothing. But she noticed the way his stride matched hers, exactly shoulder to shoulder, down the steps, boots crunching side by side. They reached the truck, placed the cider gently in the back, and climbed in without a word. The wind tossed yellow leaves across the windshield like confetti meant for someone else's celebration. Eli started the engine, shifted into gear, and let the silence stretch just long enough to feel heavy. "What would you have said if I hadn't spoken up?" he asked. Clara stared out the window, watching the buildings shrink behind them. "Same thing," she replied softly. "Sometimes the quiet between two people says more than a room full of words." The fire crackled low, its warmth curling through the cabin like a familiar lullaby. Clara sat in the rocking chair near the hearth, her hands busy with a pair of socks that had more holes than fabric. She worked the needle through the wool slowly, fingers stiff from the chill that crept in each time the wind slipped through the cracks in the window pane. Outside, frost clung to the glass in delicate patterns, catching the firelight like lace. The children had gone to bed early. Will's soft snore echoed faintly through the ceiling planks. And once, Sadie mumbled in her sleep. Clara could just make out her name, softened by dream. She reached for her tea chamomile, steeped long and sweetened with a touch of honey, and sipped, letting the warmth settle behind her ribs. Across the room, Eli sat at the kitchen table with a carving knife in one hand and a small block of wood in the other. The rhythm of blade against pine was steady, soothing. Clara had learned that he didn't speak much, but when he did, it was never wasted. Tonight, though, his silence felt companionable. He set the blade down at last and stood, crossing the room to the cupboard. "Forgot we had this," he said, lifting a plate covered with a clean dish towel. "From town." "You like apple pie?" Clara looked up, surprised. "Very much." He placed a slice on a saucer and handed it to her, then poured a second cup of tea and settled onto the edge of the hearth, close enough for the fire to light his profile in amber. They ate in silence for a moment, the crust flaky, the apples soft and sweet. Clara wiped a crumb from her lap, then glanced at the little bear Eli had been carving, now perched on the windowsill, nose turned toward the frost. "You grew up here?" she asked quietly. "Not far," he said, "past the ridge, near the river fork. My folks were loggers. Didn't talk much, neither." Clara smiled into her cup. "I grew up in Salem. My mother taught piano. I was loud back then. Or so I'm told." Eli chuckled softly. "Hard to picture." "It changed," she said, setting the empty saucer aside. "She died having my brother. He lived 4 hours. I was 7. His face turned, shadows shifting across his cheek. He didn't speak, but his attention stayed with her. My father never looked at me quite the same after—" "I suppose he couldn't," Clara continued, voice quieter now. "And I carried that guilt. Then, years later, I married. I thought if I could be a mother, it would fix something, make it right. But nothing took. Doctors, herbs, prayers, nothing. Eli didn't reach for her, didn't offer platitudes, just watched the fire for a long moment before saying, 'You keep things alive without needing to birth them.'" Clara blinked, her breath catching like a match being struck. He leaned back, arms resting on his knees. "My kids, you bring out their laughter." This house, it never felt this steady. That bear. He gestured toward the window. "Don't know why I started carving again. Just felt like it fit." Clara's throat tightened. She reached for her mending again, not because the sock needed it, but because her hands needed anchoring. A faint creak came from upstairs, then quiet again. She looked over at the small slip of folded paper on the corner of the table. Sadie's handwriting in blocky letters. "You make the house warm." Later that night, after the fire was banked and the tea had gone cold, Clara climbed the stairs, the note pressed gently in her palm. She reached into the drawer beside her bed, opened her Bible, and tucked the paper between the pages of Psalms. Then she closed the cover, placed her hand on top of it, and let the silence settle around her like a quilt. She didn't plant the garden to feed anyone. She planted it to prove something could still grow. The ground behind the cabin was more frost than dirt, hard-packed and reluctant. Clara stood with sleeves rolled up, breath fogging in front of her, the shovel trembling slightly in her hands. November had arrived with blue skies and breath that stung her lips. The trees stood bare now, their bones catching morning light. She took her first stab into the soil with a grunt, the shovel striking resistance that reminded her this land had not been disturbed in years. Clara wasn't sure what had stirred her from bed before dawn, only that her fingers ached to dig. Perhaps it was Sadie's question a few nights earlier. "Can things bloom again?" softly asked after brushing her teeth, like it had slipped past her thoughts without permission. Clara hadn't answered then, but her hands were answering now. She chipped at the frost-bitten ground with careful rhythm. Sweat gathered under her shawl, though the air still bit through the weave. She cleared a patch near the old fence, where pine needles lay scattered like sleepy confetti. Her hands stung, knuckles raw, but she kept going. Mid-morning light crept into the yard when the screen door creaked behind her. She didn't look up, but the sound of small boots crunching the frozen grass told her who it was. Will approached first, dragging a dented watering can almost his size. He said nothing, just plopped it beside the pile of loosened dirt. A minute later, Sadie appeared, clutching a battered seed packet to her chest. She knelt beside Clara, her hands tucked inside the sleeves of her coat. Clara glanced sideways. Cold out here. Sadie nodded but didn't move. After a beat, she whispered, "You need help." Clara handed her a trowel. The three of them worked quietly, the rhythm unspoken. Clara loosened soil. Sadie smoothed it. Will scattered water over it like a blessing. They didn't plant everything yet, only peas, a few tulips, and some carrots. Not because they expected much to grow, but because it felt right to try. By afternoon, Noah stepped out of the cabin, watched from the porch a moment, then disappeared. He returned carrying the tool set from the shed, a small rake, 2 gloves, and a knee pad. He placed them by Clara without speaking and stepped back. "Thank you," she said gently. He only nodded. Eli watched from farther away. He didn't approach, didn't offer to help, but every now and then, Clara could feel his gaze, flickering from behind the woodpile, or while passing the window. She didn't need him to intervene. Some silences weren't walls, they were spaces people chose to hold open. By late afternoon, they'd laid out rows. Clara stuck twigs at the end of each one, tying scraps of fabric to mark them. She turned to Sadie. "Which row should be yours?" Sadie pointed to the one closest to the swing. Clara smiled. "That'll be tulips." Then, Will claimed the next. "Carrots," he announced, wiping dirt on his cheek. "Noah?" Clara asked, tilting her head. He pointed silently to the 3rd row. Clara nodded. "Peas, it is." She didn't name one for herself, but the last row, nearest the edge of the fence, where the morning light landed first, she smoothed with special care. They were washing up inside when the hammering started, not loud, just deliberate. From the kitchen window, Clara saw Eli standing by the garden plot. He was driving a nail into a plank of wood balanced on the fence post. When he stepped away, Clara could read the carving, Clara's garden. Her breath hitched, not because of the name, but the way he'd written it, not possessive, not sentimental, just true. She stepped out onto the porch later, wrapped in her knit shawl, a thermos of coffee waiting near the steps. She didn't know when he'd left it there. The garden slept beneath the chill now, its soil dark and full of promise. She stood watching it as the light faded. The moon rose high and clean, casting soft silver over the rows like a whisper of spring. That night, Clara sat by her window, long after the others had gone to bed. She didn't light a candle. She didn't open her Bible. She just sat there, watching. The moonlight touched the soil like a promise. Some guests bring noise. Others bring peace just by staying. The kitchen hummed with warmth and motion. Steam lifted from pots on the stove, curling with the scent of turkey and cinnamon into every corner of the cabin. Clara moved easily through the room, sleeves rolled to her elbows, flour on her cheek, her hair pulled back with a ribbon Sadie had chosen that morning. Outside, pine garlands hung from the porch railing, dusted with the faintest trace of frost. A wreath made of dried orange slices and cedar branches swayed gently on the front door. Inside, the table was set with mismatched plates and cloth napkins ironed flat beneath her careful hands. It was late November, but the house glowed like it was lit from the inside out. Clara stirred the gravy and tasted it with a wooden spoon. Just right. She turned as Sadie came skipping in, cheeks pink, curls bouncing under a knit cap. She wore her Sunday dress blue with little white flowers and kept checking the mirror to be sure her collar stayed straight. "Guests coming soon," she announced. "I know," Clara said, smiling. "We're ready." Noah helped Eli bring in extra chairs from the shed. Will trailed behind, carrying a table leg like a sword. In the corner, the radio played Patsy Cline softly, her voice sweet and smoky, wrapping itself around the scent of green bean casserole and pecan pie. A knock at the door startled no one. Clara wiped her hands on a towel and opened it to find Mrs. Delaney standing proudly with a covered dish in one hand and a bright scarf knotted under her chin. "Sweet potato casserole," she declared, handing it over. "And a story or two." Eli took her coat as Clara ushered her in, later. As the food filled every inch of the table and the room swelled with voices, Mrs. Delaney leaned back in her chair and chuckled. "Your mother," she said to Clara, "once walked 6 blocks in the rain to bring me soup during the war. Never forgot that." Clara blinked. "She never told me." "She wouldn't have." Mrs. Delaney said, her eyes crinkling. "Wasn't the telling type, but the doing that she had in spades, just like someone else I know." Before Clara could answer, the front door creaked again. Tommy Ridge stepped inside, holding a pie in both hands. "Store-bought crust," he admitted, then paused. "But the filling's mine." He looked at Clara, his words slower, quieter. "You made our store feel human again. That's not nothing." She nodded, overwhelmed. The children took their seats proudly, all in church clothes, hair neatly combed, faces clean. Will insisted on sitting next to Clara. Sadie tucked her hand into Clara's under the table. Noah cleared his throat and rose slightly from his chair. "To Mama Clara," he said, voice steady. Everyone raised a glass. Clara's breath caught, but she smiled. Dinner stretched long into the early evening. Plates were scraped clean, seconds offered, and the warmth of full bellies and full hearts made the walls of the cabin seem to pulse with something bigger than just food or family. As the fire dimmed and the guests prepared to leave, Clara stood at the door in her navy sweater dress, the one Mrs. Delaney had insisted she keep, and thanked each person with quiet grace. Eli didn't speak much during the meal, but as the children dozed near the hearth and the last dish was dried and shelved, he leaned against the doorway and looked at her. He didn't smile. He nodded. And somehow, it said more than words ever could. Later that night, Clara found her coat draped neatly over the rocker. She slipped her hands into the pockets and felt a folded paper tucked deep inside, unfolding it slowly. She saw a drawing done in crayon stick figures, holding hands in front of the cabin. The trees curved above like arms. The word home was written across the top in blocky, hopeful letters. She held it close, her fingers trembling just slightly. Not all hauntings wear white sheets. Some wear familiar names and old regrets. The snow had come quietly in the night, dusting the rooftops and fence posts of Copper Hollow in soft, forgiving white. Clara stepped carefully along the sidewalk, her gloved hands gripping the flour sack close to her chest, boots crunching against the salted patches of path. The store window was fogged over, wreaths of pine and red ribbon pressed against the glass, their cheer muffled by the hush of winter. Inside, the general store was nearly empty. A basket of peppermint sticks sat near the counter, and Clara took 3-1 for each child before setting down her flour. The clerk nodded to her with a tight smile. then turned to restock the shelves. Leaving her in a quiet aisle filled with tins and paper sacks, she didn't hear the door open. She only noticed the shift in air, something colder than the weather, something older than the snow. Then, a voice. Low, frayed. Clara. She turned. Peter stood a few steps away, his coat damp at the hem, a hat clutched in both hands, like it might keep him steady. His eyes were darker than she remembered. Not with anger, but something hollow. "I wasn't sure you were still here," he said, voice almost hopeful. Clara didn't answer. She glanced briefly toward the door open. No bell this time. No witnesses, but shelves and silence. Peter took a step closer. "I heard about you and the children, about the man." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Eli." He nodded quickly. "Right. I didn't think... I just thought maybe we could talk. I shouldn't have let you go the way I did." She set the flower down gently, brushing her gloves together. "You didn't let me go. You threw me out." Peter's shoulders sagged. "My mother got in my head, said it was cursed being barren. She wouldn't let up." Then Mary came along, and Mary, Clara asked, voice calm. He swallowed. She left. Took the baby clothes. Two. There wasn't a baby. Clara tilted her head. "So now you're here. I made mistakes." His voice cracked. "I should have fought for you. I see that now." She looked at him a long moment, eyes steady. "You didn't break me. Peter, you just gave me room to grow somewhere better." He opened his mouth, but she raised a hand. "I have children who call me Mama, even if I didn't birth them. I have a man who doesn't ask what I can't give, only what I want to share." Her voice softened, but it didn't tremble. "You lost something. I didn't." Outside, snow fell in soft flakes, gathering in the folds of her coat as she stepped past him toward the counter. She paid for the flour and the peppermint sticks, nodded to the clerk, and walked into the cold. Eli stood near the wagon, one hand tucked in his pocket, the other wrapped around the reins. He didn't ask what had taken so long. He just looked at her. She climbed up beside him and tucked the sack of flour between her boots, the peppermint hidden in her coat pocket. They started off, wheels crunching through the snow. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was comfortable now, worn in like a favorite glove. After a long moment, Eli asked, "Do you miss any part of that life?" Clara kept her eyes on the road ahead, where snow blanketed the fields and fence lines, making everything look new, not even the china. She said. The first snow brought silence, but also one loud cry that changed everything. The storm had moved in slowly, overnight, coating Copper Hollow in a thick white hush. By morning, 6 inches blanketed the yard, turning the world into something soft and slow. Wind pressed against the windows, rattling the old panes. But inside the cabin, the fire crackled steady, and the smell of cinnamon drifted from a simmering pot. Clara had just pulled the last blanket from the drying rack and hung it near the hearth when the cry came. It wasn't a startled yelp or a childish whine. It was pain, real and deep. She froze. Then she ran. Outside, Will lay twisted near the old woodpile, snow already beginning to cling to his sleeves. Sadie stood nearby, frozen in place, her mittened hands at her mouth. Noah knelt beside Will, trying to keep him still. Clara dropped to her knees in the snow, her breath sharp in the wind. "Don't move him," she said gently. "Will's sweetheart, where does it hurt?" He sobbed, pointing to his leg. "Hurts bad." Clara peeled back the snow-damp pant leg and saw the ankle, already beginning to swell. "I've got you," she murmured, brushing hair from his forehead. Eli burst through the back door, coat half-buttoned, eyes wild. "What happened?" "He fell." Noah said quickly, climbing. Clara didn't look up. Bring the ruler from the school box and 2 strips of cloth, long ones. Eli hesitated, then ran. Inside. The warmth hit like a wave, but Clara's hands didn't stop. She placed Will gently on the long bench near the fire, drying his skin as she examined the injury. When Eli returned, she wrapped the leg tight, using the wooden ruler to hold the joint in place. Will bit down on a scrap of cloth, tears leaking down his cheeks. "You're all right," Clara whispered, nodding the final wrap. "You're brave." Eli hovered near the hearth, shoulders hunched. He watched her without blinking, his jaw clenched so tight it trembled. Clara met his eyes briefly. "He'll be okay," he nodded, then sat down hard on the edge of the table. His face pale. Clara rose, poured water into a kettle, and set it to warm. The room felt heavy, like the storm had pushed its way inside. When the tea was ready, she handed a mug to Eli. His fingers trembled as he took it. "Thank you," he said quietly. She sat across from him. "You're allowed to be scared." "I wasn't scared," he said, then paused. "I was helpless." Clara offered a soft smile. It's not weakness to watch someone else lead. Later that evening, the storm had calmed. Blankets were hung to dry. The children had all settled into the living area. Their sleeping spots moved closer together for warmth and comfort. Will, tucked under 3 quilts, blinked up at Clara with sleepy eyes. "Don't leave," he whispered. She leaned in. "I'm not going anywhere." "Mama," he said, barely audible, then closed his eyes. Clara didn't speak. She sat beside him long after he drifted off. Eli came to stand behind her. He didn't touch her, just stood there, close enough to feel his presence. "You stayed," he said quietly, "even when you didn't have to. That's what real family does." Clara turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes. The fire crackled between them, casting their shadows long on the wall. Much later, when the cabin was quiet again and the snow outside glowed under a pale moon, Clara sat alone at the table with her journal. She opened to a clean page and let the ink soak into the paper slowly, her handwriting careful, unhurried. "I used to be discarded. Now, I'm needed. Some roots grow slow, but they grow deep." The thaw came quietly to Copper Hollow, announced not by warmth, but by sound. Birdsong returned, like memory, gentle, persistent, undeniable. Icicles let go of the eaves one by one, tapping like soft knuckles against the windows. And in the backyard of the cabin, the garden. Claire's garden breathed its first real breath of green. She sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a knit shawl, a journal resting open across her knees. The pages fluttered now and then in the breeze, but she held her pen still, letting her thoughts steep like tea. The soil had softened, just enough. Tiny green tips pushed through last season's mulch like whispers of a promise kept. The tulips would come soon, the carrots were still shy, but something in the earth had answered her, at last. Behind her. The screen door creaked, and Eli stepped out, wood shavings clinging to his shirt. He carried something in both hands, a plank of polished cedar, freshly carved. The scent of it followed him like smoke. He nodded toward the garden fence. "Thought we could hang this one today?" Clara leaned forward, eyes tracing the words carved deep into the grain. "She didn't bear my blood, but she gave birth to our life." She swallowed gently. "It's beautiful. I didn't plan the words," Eli said, rubbing his neck. "They just came." Down by the tulip row, Sadie and Will crouched beside a patch of soft soil, pushing tiny bulbs into the dirt with careful fingers. Noah worked nearby, anchoring a row of stakes with surprising precision. Mrs. Delaney's old Ford rumbled up the drive just as the sun reached its warmest. She stepped out, with a basket of rolls tucked under one arm and a bouquet of yarn tied like a ribbon in her hair. "Still baking?" she called, "but I figured you'd need something fresh today." Clara laughed, stood to greet her, and helped set the basket on the porch table. The smell of rosemary and butter wrapped around the cabin like welcome. Tommy Ridge arrived an hour later with a bookshelf strapped into the back of his truck. "For your tutoring," he said plainly. "Kids ought to have a place to put their books." Clara blinked, surprised. "How did you know?" He shrugged. "Town council said yes to the library program. Figured you'd say yes too." Clara nodded slowly. "Yes, I'd like that very much." As the day eased toward evening, Clara stepped inside for just a moment, retrieved a small package from the drawer beside her bed, and returned to the porch. The children gathered around. It was a simple locket silver, worn soft by time, and inside were 4 names written in her own careful hand: Noah, Sadie, Will, and Eli. They'd given her something, too. A leather-bound notebook, the kind that invited beginnings. "For your stories," Noah had said, "so you don't forget anything." She sat on the porch swing again, opened to the first page, and wrote slowly, "Today, I am no longer the woman they gave away. I am the woman they came home to." When she finished, she didn't close the journal right away. She tore the page from the spine with care, folding it twice, then once more. The creases fit perfectly in her palm. She walked to the garden, where the tulips had begun to claim their space, and knelt beside Sadie. "What's that?" the girl asked. "A promise," Clara whispered. She dug a small hole just beside the first sprout, nestled the page inside, and covered it gently with earth. Her fingers pressed flat against the soil, and for a moment, she simply breathed. Eli watched from the porch, eyes soft beneath his brim. The wind shifted, carrying birdsong and the scent of warming pine. From the town came word that the new garden plot at the school, once ignored, now planned with care, would bear a new name voted on by the children and their families. Clara's corner. Clara smiled, brushing dirt from her palms, and looked out across the place where her roots had finally taken hold. She hadn't planted the garden to feed anyone, but somehow it had fed them all, in the soft thaw of a late winter morning. Clara's garden stood not as a symbol of what was lost, but of what had taken root in its place, quiet, steady, and deeply loved. Through seasons of silence, judgment, and longing, she found something more enduring than blood or birthright, a place where she was chosen, not claimed. Sometimes, the kindest act isn't loud or grand, it's simply staying when no one asked you to. And when we stop measuring worth by what's missing, we finally see what's been growing all along. If this story stirred something in you, perhaps take a moment to notice who's still beside you, or to be that someone for someone else. Because like a garden in frost, kindness remembers where it was planted. Thank you for spending time with us today. If Clara's story touched your heart the way it touched ours, we'd be so grateful if you gave this video a like, shared it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Because here, we believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet strength of the human heart.